The dense woods rustled under the weight of two shadowy figures. Their uniforms gleamed faintly under the pale moonlight, police officers. But these weren't just any cops. Their hurried whispers and shifty glances spoke volumes. Clutched in their hands was a tattered duffel bag, its contents unknown, but clearly important. They dug frantically, burying the bag deep beneath the forest floor, thinking they were alone. But they weren't. Hiding behind a thick tree trunk was Sophie, a curious 8-year-old who had wandered away from her nearby campsite. She clutched her flashlight tightly, her wide eyes locked on the scene unfolding before her. What could be in that bag? And why were the officers acting so suspiciously? Sophie's innocent curiosity had unknowingly placed her in the middle of a dangerous secret. As the officers walked away, Sophie made a decision. She had to find out the truth. But would her discovery come at a cost? Sophie stayed rooted behind the tree, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the two officers disappear into the shadows. She had never seen anything like this before. Why would police officers, the very people her parents said were there to protect them, act so strangely? The bag looked heavy, its corners bulging as if something important, or dangerous, was inside. As she crept closer to the freshly dug hole, Sophie's mind raced. Could it be stolen money? Evidence from a crime? She remembered overhearing news stories her dad would talk about: corruption, missing people, secrets buried in small towns like hers. A chill ran down her spine, but her curiosity was stronger than her fear. Nearby, the faint sound of laughter and campfire crackling from her family reminded her she wasn't completely alone. But as Sophie reached the edge of the hole, she realized one thing: there was no going back now. Sophie crouched near the freshly dug dirt, her tiny hands trembling as she brushed some leaves aside. The spot where the bag was buried looked ordinary, but the weight of what she had seen made it feel anything but. Her imagination ran wild. Could the officers have been hiding something illegal? Or maybe they weren't bad at all. Maybe they were covering something up for a good reason. But why hide it in the middle of the woods? She heard a distant noise, a twig snapping in the darkness. Sophie froze, her breath catching. Had they come back? Her flashlight was off, but the thought of being caught made her stomach twist. After a moment of silence, she dared a glance over her shoulder. Nothing. Still, the tension lingered, like the woods themselves were holding a secret too big to contain. Meanwhile, back at the campsite, Sophie's parents were starting to worry. Her mother's voice carried through the night, calling her name. Sophie hesitated. If she ran back now, she could forget everything and pretend she'd never seen those officers. But the question burned in her mind: what was in that bag? And why would cops risk everything to hide it? Sophie decided she couldn't walk away just yet. She'd return later, maybe even dig it up herself. But for now, she crept back to the camp, her thoughts racing. Little did she know, someone else had been watching her all along. That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of the bag being buried replayed in her mind. The officers' hurried movements, the way they looked over their shoulders, it all felt wrong. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the family's small tent, her parents' soft snores the only sound in the quiet woods. When the first light of dawn crept into the tent, Sophie slipped out, careful not to wake anyone. She grabbed her flashlight and a small garden trowel from the campsite supplies. Her plan was simple. She'd dig up the bag just to see what was inside. But as she retraced her steps from the night before, an uneasy feeling followed her. What if the officers came back? When she finally reached the spot, Sophie knelt down and began to dig, her heart pounding with every scoop of dirt. The ground was soft, and it didn't take long before she hit something. She brushed away the remaining soil and froze. The corner of the bag was visible now, its fabric damp and muddy. Suddenly, a crackling sound came from nearby, a voice over a radio. Sophie panicked and ducked behind a tree, clutching the trowel tightly. Peeking out, she saw one of the officers from the night before. He was scanning the area, his hand resting on his belt. Sophie's heart raced. He wasn't alone. The two officers began talking in low voices, their expressions tense. One of them gestured toward the buried bag. Sophie realized they were checking to make sure it hadn't been disturbed. She held her breath, praying they wouldn't notice the small patch of dirt she had uncovered. Her pulse thundered as she watched, torn between running back to camp and staying hidden. But then one of the officers stopped suddenly, his gaze narrowing. Sophie's stomach dropped. Had he seen her tracks? Sophie stayed completely still, her small frame pressed against the rough bark of the tree. She could see the officer's eyes scanning the ground, his expression darkening as he nudged the disturbed dirt with his boot. Her heart felt like it might give her away, thudding so loudly she was sure they'd hear it. The second officer stepped forward, his tone sharp. "You sure no one saw us last night?" "I'm sure," the first officer replied, but there was doubt in his voice. He crouched down, inspecting the area more closely. But something's not right. This wasn't like this before. Sophie's stomach knotted. She realized her tracks, the faint impressions of her small shoes, had been left behind. She had been careful, but not careful enough. The officer straightened, his hand now resting on the radio clipped to his shoulder. "We might have a problem," he muttered. Just then, a faint rustling sound came from deeper in the woods. The officers froze, their attention shifting. Sophie turned her head toward the noise, her breath catching. It wasn't her parents or campers. It was someone else. From the shadows emerged a third figure, a man dressed in civilian clothes, his face partially obscured by a hood. "Relax," the man said in a low voice. "I'm here to make sure everything stays quiet." Sophie watched in shock, her fear mixing with confusion. Who was this man, and why did he seem to be in charge? The officers exchanged uneasy glances but didn't protest. The hooded man stepped closer to the buried bag, his tone turning cold. "If anyone finds this, it's not just your job's on the line. You understand me?" Sophie's mind raced. Whatever was in that bag wasn't just important, it was dangerous. And now she was caught in something far bigger than she could have imagined. As Sophie pressed herself deeper into the shadows, she realized she couldn't stay hidden much longer. The officers and the hooded man were too close, their voices carrying tension as they debated what to do next. Her curiosity had turned into fear, but it was too late to back out now. The hooded man reached down and pulled the bag from the dirt with surprising ease. He unzipped it just enough for Sophie to catch a glimpse. A stack of envelopes, all sealed, and what looked like a small metal lockbox. "This stays between us," he growled, his eyes darting between the officers. "We can't afford mistakes." Suddenly, a loud snap echoed through the woods. Everyone froze, including Sophie. It wasn't her. It came from the opposite direction. The hooded man motioned for the officers to check it out. They moved cautiously, but in their distraction, Sophie saw her chance. She took a deep breath and bolted, her small feet crunching on leaves as she ran toward the campsite. The commotion drew their attention. "Hey," one of the officers shouted, but Sophie didn't look back. She didn't stop until she was in the clearing by her family's tent, gasping for air. Her parents rushed to her, alarmed. "Where were you?" Her mom asked, but Sophie couldn't answer. Before she could explain, headlights pierced the morning fog. A park ranger's truck rolled into the campsite, the driver stepping out and surveying the scene. "Is everything okay here?" the ranger asked, his sharp eyes catching Sophie's panicked expression. Just then, a voice crackled through the ranger's radio. "We've got suspicious activity reported in the woods near the East Trail." Sophie's heart sank. The officers were still out there, and now they'd know she had seen everything. But as the ranger looked down at Sophie, there was something familiar in his gaze, an unspoken understanding. "Stay here," he said firmly, heading toward the trail. Before Sophie could respond, her dad placed a protective arm around her. The danger seemed to pass, but in her gut, Sophie knew this wasn't over. Somewhere in those woods, secrets were still buried, some she might never understand. As she clutched her flashlight, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hooded man's warning wasn't just for the officers. It was for anyone who dared to uncover the truth.